The shout cracked through the cabin like a snapped cable under tension. "Ma'am, you need to step back right now." The words hit the quiet first-class aisle with a force that made several heads turn. A single glass rattled on a tray, and Evelyn Carter, standing perfectly still under the dimmed cabin lights, felt every eye press onto her like a verdict being delivered before the trial even began. The air held a heavy stillness, the kind that follows an insult no one can yet name. Across from her, the senior flight attendant, Margaret Doyle, squared her shoulders, breath short, jaw tight. Her silver hair didn't move, but something colder shifted behind her eyes. It wasn't anger. It was certainty. The certainty of someone who believed she could not be wrong. Not here. Not in her domain. Evelyn didn't speak. Her hands rested lightly on the armrest of her seat, but her breath came slower now, deeper, like someone guiding herself through a storm no one else could see. The hum of the engines filled the silence, steady and low, a reminder that the world was moving, even when decency was not. She lowered herself into her seat again, her movements controlled, quiet, precise. Margaret watched her with the stiff focus of a guard dog waiting for a command only she could hear. Further down the cabin, Alison Brooks, young Ernest, still learning how authority could shift so quickly it shook your bones, froze, with a tray half lowered. She swallowed hard. A soft clink of porcelain betrayed her trembling fingers. She didn't look at Margaret. She didn't dare. Her gaze flicked to Evelyn for half a second, apology already glistening behind her eyes. She had served Evelyn the salmon on tray an hour earlier, her voice bright, her movements careful. She had smiled with pride. It was a beautiful dish, warm and fragrant, one of the few things on the flight that felt human. And that was the problem. Margaret stepped closer now, her voice softer but sharper. "We have procedures. You know that." It was addressed to Alison, but meant for everyone. A reminder, a warning, a rewriting of truth before anyone else could claim it. Evelyn let her eyelids lower for a moment. She felt the cool leather beneath her palms, the faint citrus scent lingering on her fingertips from the lemon twist garnish she hadn't touched. She had not eaten a single bite. She had barely inhaled the aroma before the atmosphere shifted. Before Margaret stood over her voice, taut, insisting the entree did not belong to her row. Before she lifted the tray away with the ceremonious disgust of someone removing a counterfeit item from a museum. But the humiliation wasn't the part that stung. It was the precision, the intention. Something in Margaret's posture, in the rigid corners of her voice, had made it clear this was not a misunderstanding. It was a decision. And decisions have histories. The man in 4C lifted his head from his newspaper, one of those seasoned travelers who had seen too much to pretend he hadn't. His eyes moved from Evelyn to Margaret, reading them like two entries in a ledger. His breath tightened a quiet exhale through his nose. He didn't speak, but something in his expression betrayed a flicker of recognition or guilt. People who had lived long enough knew the shape of the injustice long before it gained a name. At the front of the cabin, the purser's phone buzzed with a soft vibration. A message flashed across the tiny screen. He read it, blinked, and stepped behind the curtain as if hiding from the implications. Silence thickened into something watchful. And in seat 3, Evelyn Carter opened her eyes. No anger, no tears, just clarity. Her mind, steady and clinical, filed the moment. The tone, the stance, the unnecessary volume of the first words shouted down the aisle. She didn't need a journal. She didn't need time. Her memory worked cleanly, like a surgeon's cut. What Margaret did not know, what no one here knew, was that the decision formed in Evelyn's mind. This moment would alter far more than the evening of a single flight. Because there were systems tied to her name, entire operations resting on her authority, and contracts far bigger than the cabin they now sat in. But none of that power flickered across her face. Not yet. For now, Evelyn simply reached forward, folded the linen napkin that had been left on her tray table, and placed it beside the untouched bread roll. The engines hummed, the lights dimmed slightly, the cabin exhaled, and somewhere deep inside the quiet storm of her composure, something turned, something final, something Margaret would never see coming until it was far too late. The captain's voice floated through the cabin, calm and unbothered, as if the tension simmering below his feet did not exist at all. Ladies and gentlemen, will be reaching cruising altitude shortly. But no one in first class heard the rest. Their attention had narrowed to the quiet war unfolding around seat 3A, where Evelyn sat with her hands, folded her posture, regal untouched by the rising uncertainty rippling around her. Margaret moved with the rigid grace of someone reclaiming territory. She approached the galley, her heels tapping an uneven rhythm against the carpet. Alison trailed behind her, carrying the weight of a mistake she wasn't sure she had made. She glanced back once, just once, toward Evelyn. That glance held fear, regret, and something else. A question she didn't dare voice. Why did this feel so wrong? Margaret didn't bother turning. You need to learn that being agreeable doesn't mean you're being professional, she murmured low enough that only Alison could hear. Passengers ask for a lot of things. It doesn't mean they get them. Her voice had a practiced confidence, the kind built over decades of believing she was the last barrier between order and chaos. Alison swallowed. But she was polite. And we still had one entree left. That entree was meant for a loyalty-tier passenger. Margaret didn't hide her irritation. I know exactly who gets what. You'll follow my lead, not your instincts. A soft clang echoed from the galley as Margaret set the remains of the salmon plate, scraped bare, rinsed of evidence into the service sink. But the faint scent of rosemary still lingered in the air like an accusation. She wiped her hands' movements, brisk, controlled, as if erasing a crime before anyone noticed. Except someone had noticed. Actually several someones. In 5B, a woman old enough to remember the civil rights marches of her youth leaned forward, her knitting needles stilling in her lap. Her eyes narrowed, not in nosiness, but in recognition. She'd lived long enough to know when a line had been crossed. Her husband, seated beside her, shook his head with a quiet sigh and murmured, "Some things never change." Back in seat 3. Evelyn breathed in slowly, deeply. She felt the sting of the moment, but she didn't let it settle. She let it move through her like cold water, sharpening each thought. Her fingertips brushed the edge of the armrest, the leather soft beneath her touch. In her mind, a new timeline began. Calm, deliberate, inevitable. She had encountered women like Margaret before, people who believed power was a ladder, and they alone decided who deserved a rung. But Evelyn had built an entire branch of her life, dismantling ladders exactly like that. One policy review, one contract clause, one conversation with the right person in the right room. Margaret had no idea how small this moment truly was in the scale of what she had just set in motion. A faint rustle broke the silence. The man across the aisle in 3C leaned slightly forward. He was old-school corporate, the kind who still preferred fountain pens over tablets. He cleared his throat softly, catching Evelyn's eye with a look that hovered between apology and respect. "If you need someone to speak up," he murmured, barely audible. "I saw everything." Evelyn offered him a polite nod, grateful, but not dependent. She had spent too many years learning how to stand alone when she had to. The turbulence sign flicked on with a muted chime, and the plane shuddered lightly. Margaret seized the opportunity, stepping briskly down the aisle to reassert her control. "Everyone remain seated," she announced, though no one had tried to stand. Protocol was her shield, and she wielded it with visible relief. But when she reached Evelyn's row again, something shifted in her expression. A flicker, small, sharp, fleeting, ran across her features. Unease. Evelyn's composure, her silence, her lack of fluster, it didn't fit the script Margaret expected. Most passengers protested, grew defensive, demanded answers. This woman had simply watched her with patient, unsettling stillness, as if waiting for Margaret to catch up to a truth she didn't yet know. "Is there anything else you need?" Margaret asked, stiffly formally. "No," Evelyn said. Her voice was soft enough to blend with the cabin hum, yet firm enough to stop Margaret's breath for half a second. "Not at the moment." Not at the moment. A simple phrase, but Margaret heard the undertone, a quiet, measured promise that felt far too controlled. She straightened, smoothing her uniform, forcing a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Allison appeared again, holding a water bottle with both hands. She stepped closer to Evelyn, carefully bypassing Margaret. "I'm very sorry for earlier," she whispered. "If you need anything at all, just press the call button. Please." Evelyn studied her gently. "Thank you, Allison. You've been nothing but kind." Tears threatened at the edges of the young woman's eyes, but she blinked them away and gave a small nod before hurrying off. Margaret watched her go, jaw flexing, but said nothing. Another jolt of turbulence passed, and the lights flickered, once then stabilized. The engines hummed lower now, steady constant. Evelyn reached down, opened her leather tote, and drew out a small tablet. The screen lit her face in soft gold. One email draft glowed at the top. "Subject Service Incident Review. Immediate attention required." Her finger hovered over the screen for a moment, not touching, not typing. She didn't need to write it yet. Not while her thoughts were still crystallizing into something sharper. Instead, she set the tablet down, folded her hands, and looked ahead. The plane flew on through the dark, unaware that somewhere above the Midwest, an unspoken reckoning was already forming, quiet, precise, and inevitable. Under the dimmed cabin lights, the night settled into that strange, suspended quiet unique to long flights, where time seemed to loosen and stretch. But in seat 3, time sharpened instead. Every second carved itself into Evelyn's awareness with crisp, unwavering clarity. She sensed movement before she saw it, the kind of subtle shift in air that precedes an unwelcome approach. Margaret's steps were soft this time, controlled, almost measured. She wasn't storming down the aisle now. She moved like someone preparing a stage for a scene she planned to dominate. Her shadow slid across the aisle wall before she appeared beside Evelyn, clutching a tablet against her chest. "We have a situation," she announced, her voice carrying just enough to draw the attention of 5B and 4C. Not loud, but pointed. "A discrepancy in our cabin seating records. It seems this row may have been misassigned." Evelyn lifted her gaze slowly. Calm, steady. A single blink, deliberate and unhurried. "Misassigned," she repeated, her tone neutral. How so? Margaret angled the tablet. The cabin lights reflected off the screen, making the data unreadable to anyone, but that didn't matter. The purpose wasn't accuracy. It was authority. This seat, she said, tapping vaguely at the display, is flagged for a mileage plus priority guest. Those designations are rarely incorrect. Evelyn didn't look at the screen. She looked at Margaret. And Margaret continued, her voice tightening. We may need to verify your boarding details for protocol. A soft breath escaped from the older woman in 5B. Not a gasp, more of a weary exhale, like someone watching a mistake they'd seen repeated too many times across too many years. Her knitting needles paused mid-loop. Her husband glanced at her, then at Margaret, and his jaw set in a silent warning. But Margaret didn't see them. She saw only Evelyn. Evelyn reached slowly into her tote, pulled out her boarding pass, and handed it over. Her hands were steady, her breath even. She felt no tremor in her chest, only a slow coiling of resolve. Margaret barely looked at the pass before lowering the tablet. It's possible our system glitched, she said, tone falsely conciliatory. These things happen. But the edge beneath the sentence was sharp, intentional. Evelyn waited. Margaret hesitated just long enough to betray the crack in her confidence. We'll sort this out, she muttered, but seat adjustments may be necessary. A quiet shifting of fabric came from 3C. The older businessman leaned forward again, voice low. Ma'am, he said to Evelyn, you shouldn't have to deal with this. His tone carried the polite outrage of someone raised to value dignity above convenience. Margaret shot him a tight smile. Sir, please allow us to handle internal procedures. He didn't smile back. I watched you take her meal, he said simply. I watched how you spoke to her. His voice didn't rise. It didn't threaten. It simply existed, undeniable and steady. Margaret flushed not red, but a pale shade that washed upward from her collar, draining the commanding certainty from her features. She opened her mouth, closed it again, then turned back to Evelyn. Let me just confirm this with the purser, she said, retreating without waiting for a response. Evelyn watched her disappear behind the curtain, the fabric swaying gently, as if exhaling after holding too much tension. Alison emerged moments later, moving hesitantly toward Evelyn's row. Her steps were quiet, as if she hoped not to disturb something fragile in the air. Miss Carter, she whispered, leaning close to avoid being overheard. I'm sorry. Truly. She's been tense today. There was something with the crew roster earlier. Some argument with the purser before boarding. She swallowed. It isn't you. Evelyn studied her carefully, noting the tremble in her fingers, the way her voice cracked around the truth she feared to speak too plainly. Thank you, Alison, she said softly. But that isn't an excuse for mistreatment. Alison nodded, eyes shining with a mixture of fear and relief. I know. And I don't think the purser agrees with her. I overheard him calling operations earlier. Something about workload reviews and evaluations being audited this month. A new thread tugged at Evelyn's attention. An audit. Internal tension. A crew roster dispute. These weren't just details, they were pressure points. A system under strain reveals its fractures cleanly. Before Evelyn could respond, the curtain snapped back. The purser, tall, composed, with the stiff posture of someone balancing authority and exhaustion, stepped out. Miss Carter, he said, his voice gentler than Margaret's, but still formal. May I have a moment? Every passenger watching seemed to hold their breath. Evelyn stood smoothing her blazer. Of course. He cleared his throat. There appears to be a conflict in our system, but we are working to resolve it. In the meantime, please remain seated. We are not asking you to move." Margaret appeared behind him, stiff, disbelieving. The purser continued before she could speak. "And Miss Doyle, please refrain from further adjustments until we have clarity." The fissure between them widened, visible now to the entire cabin. Evelyn sat again, composed. The purser returned behind the curtain. Margaret stayed frozen for a heartbeat, eyes flicking from Evelyn to Allison to the passengers now openly watching her. And for the first time all evening, doubt settled into her posture like an unwelcome passenger. Evelyn closed her eyes, letting the moment imprint itself clearly. Not for revenge, for truth, for what would come next. The cabin lights dimmed further as the flight crossed into darker skies, the kind of thick, velvety blue that swallowed the horizon whole. Outside the windows, nothing moved but faint streaks of distant clouds. Inside, tension pooled like water in a tilted bowl, settling unmistakably around row 3. Conversations hushed, pages stopped turning. Even the hum of the engines seemed to lower as though the aircraft itself were listening. Margaret lingered halfway down the aisle, pretending to review a service checklist, while her eyes kept drifting toward Evelyn. Each glance grew sharper, brittle. She had expected the purser to back her, to reaffirm her authority in front of passengers. Instead, he had clipped her wings in full view of the cabin. The humiliation sat hot in her chest, rising like static. In seat 3C, the older businessman shifted. His breathing was steady, but his jaw flexed with a subtle tension, the kind of movement that suggested a man long accustomed to watching things he could not stop. He glanced over the top of his glasses, studying Margaret's rigid posture. A sigh left him soft but weighted, as if he'd watched this same play unfold too many times over too many years. Behind him, the woman in 5B resumed her knitting, but her needles clicked faster now, betraying nerves she refused to voice. Her husband rested a gentle hand on her arm, murmuring something low that only she heard. She nodded once, but her eyes stayed fixed on Evelyn, concern knitting deeper than the yarn in her lap. Evelyn sat with her back straight, shoulders relaxed, her breathing measured and slow. But her mind was a rising tide. Thoughts interlocked, forming patterns. Voices from years past flickered in and out. Lectures she'd given about service standards. Conversations with chefs about quality control. Negotiations with executives who learned quickly that underestimating her was a mistake. The contrast between those rooms and this narrow aisle struck her like a cold blade. A soft click interrupted her thoughts. Allison appeared again, carrying a bottle of still water and a fresh glass. She approached cautiously, as if navigating a fault line. "I wanted to bring this just in case you need anything," she whispered. Evelyn accepted it gently. "Thank you, Allison." The young woman's throat bobbed as she swallowed. "She's never like this," she said, voice trembling. "Well, not usually. It's been a hard month. New performance reviews. Cutbacks. People are scared." Evelyn studied her face, noting the raw honesty there. Not an excuse, an explanation. Fear changes people, but it does not justify them. Before she could answer, the curtain at the front snapped back again. Not the purser this time, the captain. His tall frame filled the aisle, his expression stern but unreadable. He scanned the cabin and then approached Margaret, speaking in low tones. Evelyn caught fragments. "Report filed, passenger complaint already logged, handle this. Professionally, no further escalation." Tonight, Margaret stiffened, clutching her tablet to her chest like a shield. Captain with respect, there was a discrepancy. I was addressing it. The captain's jaw tightened. "You've addressed it enough." A flicker of outrage flared across her face, then vanished beneath a mask of obedience. She nodded, but anyone watching closely could see the crack running right through her composure. The captain stepped toward Evelyn, then stopping at her row. He offered a polite, formal smile. "Miss Carter, thank you for your patience this evening. If there is anything you need, my crew will accommodate to the best of our ability." The cabin fell silent. Even the knitting needles paused. Evelyn inclined her head, calm and dignified. "I appreciate that, Captain." He nodded once more and returned to the flight deck, the curtain swaying shut behind him like the closing of a stage scene. Margaret remained where she stood, stunned, breath shallow. Each muscle in her face held tension she could no longer mask. She turned abruptly and strode toward the galley shoulders, rigid. The passengers watched her go, the sound of her shoes clipped and uneven, no longer the confident cadence from earlier. Allison slipped into the empty space she'd left behind, offering Evelyn a timid, hopeful smile before stepping away to serve other passengers. For the first time since boarding, the cabin eased. Not relaxed, never that, but eased like a room where someone finally opened a window. But beneath that brief calm, deeper currents shifted. Because what Margaret didn't know, what the captain did not yet know, what no one on the aircraft could possibly know was that the report filed against her had not originated in Seat 3A alone. A separate message had already been sent from the ground, triggered hours before, takeoff concerning a pattern of behavior on recent flights. An audit, a discrepancy in crew evaluations. Someone had flagged her weeks ago. Tonight's incident wasn't the beginning. It was the confirmation. And Evelyn, sitting quietly in her leather seat, was beginning to sense that this story, not just hers, not just Margaret's, was far larger than the aisle that contained it. The cabin settled into a strange hush, the kind that arrives when everyone senses that something important is unfolding, but no one knows quite what shape it will take. Outside, the night stretched wide and dark, the plane carving through it like a single glowing thread. Inside, every thread of tension seemed woven around the narrow galley curtain where Margaret had vanished minutes earlier. Evelyn watched the shadows move beneath the curtain, slow and uneven. The sounds were faint, but telling a muffled exhale, the clatter of metal trays, a drawer closed a little too sharply. Someone unraveling, someone realizing the ground beneath them was shifting in ways they could no longer control. In 3 Seal, the businessman leaned back, arms crossed loosely, but his eyes were fixed, forward alert. Not nosy concerned. He had seen lives come apart quietly before, in boardrooms and late-night offices, without anyone raising their voice. There was a look he recognized now in the air, the look of a person who knew power was slipping from her grasp. Then the curtain opened. Margaret emerged, face composed, but pale as though she'd stared too long into some uncomfortable truth. She didn't look at Evelyn. She didn't look at anyone. She walked the aisle with the rigid steps of someone repeating a silent mantra, just to stay upright. But when she reached row 4, a voice halted her. "Excuse me, Miss Doyle." It was the older woman in 5B, the knitter. Her needles rested on her lap. Her voice was calm, but it carried the unmistakable firmness of a woman who had spoken up during eras when it cost far more than a quiet flight. Margaret turned, strained smile in place. "Yes, ma'am. How may I assist you? I've flown for many decades." The woman began, her eyes steady. "And I've seen many kinds of crew members. What I saw tonight was not service. It was judgment." The knitting needles clicked softly in the silence. Margaret's throat tightened. "Ma'am, I assure you—" "No," the woman cut in gently. "You don't need to assure me. You need to reflect." Her husband laid a supportive hand on her arm, but she didn't look away. Margaret opened her mouth, closed it, then nodded once, before continuing down the aisle. Her steps were slower now, uncertain, as though the aisle itself had turned unfamiliar. Meanwhile, in the forward galley, the purser reappeared carrying a small, worn leather binder. His expression was thoughtful, troubled. He approached Evelyn with a quiet professionalism that carried none of Margaret's edge. "Ms. Carter," he said softly, "I'd like to apologize again for the disruption earlier. I understand your evening has been less than comfortable." Evelyn looked up, her gaze direct but warm. "Thank you. I realize these situations can be complex." He hesitated, glancing briefly toward the galley before leaning slightly closer. "There is something I should tell you. Not confidential, but contextual." The word landed carefully, deliberately. "Our crew assignments were shuffled last minute this week," he continued. "Oversight is reviewing several performance evaluations, particularly in the long-haul teams. It's been tense. People are nervous." And sometimes he paused. Nerves bring out the worst instincts. Evelyn felt a stir inside her chest, not surprise, but recognition. Systems under pressure reveal their fractures most clearly at the point of human contact. She had built an entire career understanding that. "Thank you for telling me," she said. "I told you," a voice whispered suddenly from behind the purser. "Allison." She stood, clutching a stack of linen napkins, her face still carrying the remnants of earlier guilt. She looked at the purser first, then at Evelyn. "I overheard something before. The flight," she said, voice barely above a breath. "In the crew room, someone from operations called in, asking questions about Ms. Doyle's last few trips, about customer responses. She got defensive, really defensive." The purser shot her a warning look, but she continued, a tremor of courage threading through her words. "And when she came on board, she told me she wasn't going to let anyone test her authority tonight." The purser exhaled slowly. Evelyn felt the pieces shift into place. So this wasn't about a meal. This wasn't about a seat. It wasn't even about her. This was about Margaret fighting a battle she thought she was losing long before Evelyn ever stepped on board. The cabin light flickered softly as the aircraft adjusted altitude, a small tremor passing through the aisle. The atmosphere changed with it almost imperceptibly, like the inhale before a storm breaks. Evelyn rested her hand on her armrest, her posture steady, her voice calm. "Thank you, Allison. I appreciate your honesty." Allison's breath shuddered with relief. The purser gave a small nod, grateful that Evelyn seemed more composed than anyone else in the cabin. But in seat 3A, the calm was not acceptance. It was clarity. A deeper story was unfolding, one that stretched far beyond this flight. Something inside the airline was cracking, shifting, making room for truth to surface in ways no one had foreseen. And Evelyn Carter, silent and steady, was about to become the catalyst for all of it. The plane leveled out again, the engines softening into a low, constant vibration beneath the floor. But the calm that settled over the cabin was deceptive, like the quiet that lingers over a field moments before lightning strikes. Evelyn felt it, the passengers sensed it, and somewhere deep in the crew's silent choreography, the tension kept tightening thread by invisible thread. From her seat, Evelyn watched the cabin, the way a seasoned conductor watches an orchestra not for beauty, but for imbalance. People reveal themselves in pressure. Systems reveal themselves in cracks. Tonight both were beginning to speak. Margaret reappeared at the far end of the aisle, shoulders straighter than before, chin lifted, as if she'd coached herself back into control. But her steps betrayed her. They didn't land evenly. She paused at row 4, smoothing her uniform, forcing a smile that strained at the edges. Her eyes flicked to Evelyn, just a fraction of a second too long. A look not of authority now, but calculation. A look of someone trying to assess the damage she feared she'd already inflicted on herself. She moved on. But in 3C, the older businessman wasn't finished witnessing. He leaned sideways, voice low but firm. "She's unraveling," he murmured to Evelyn. "I've seen that look in boardrooms right before someone realizes the numbers aren't in their favor." Evelyn didn't respond with words. She simply breathed in slow and steady, the kind of breath people take when gathering their strength, not for reaction, but for strategy. Further back, the knitting woman paused again, her needles hovering mid-air. Her gaze followed Margaret all the way to the front galley. When she spoke, her voice carried a quiet weight. "I marched in 68, she said to no one in particular. "I know what it looks like when someone tries to stand taller by pushing someone else down. It never ends how they think it will." Her husband nodded, patting her hand, but his eyes stayed fixed ahead, watching, not interfering as older men often do when they understand a reckoning is inevitable. Inside the forward galley, the curtain rustled as Margaret confronted the purser again. Voices rose, not loud enough for content, but loud enough for tone. Sharp, defensive, repeated phrases. "You undermined me. I had every right," passenger hierarchy. "The audit isn't my fault," Evelyn heard enough. Then abruptly, the voices vanished. The curtain fluttered. The purser emerged alone, jaw tight, eyes drawn inward, with the weight of a decision he hadn't wanted to make. He approached Evelyn again. "Ms. Carter, I need to ask you a question." Evelyn nodded once. "Go ahead." "Would you be willing to make a formal statement when we land?" His voice was low, steady, but underneath it lived a quiet urgency. Not a complaint, just a factual account. There is an internal review underway, and tonight's events may be relevant. Evelyn studied him carefully. "You're asking because this isn't the first incident." His silence was answer enough. Before he could speak further, Margaret burst through the curtain behind him, not with anger, but something far more fragile, fear. Her voice pitched too high, too brittle. "Are you seriously entertaining this?" she demanded. "Over a seat check? Over an entree assignment?" "This is absurd." Passengers turned toward her, startled by the sharpness of her tone. Even Allison flinched where she stood near row 2. The purser stepped between Margaret and the cabin. "Ms. Doyle," he said quietly, "please return to the galley." "No." Her voice cracked. "No, I won't stand back while you undermine me again. I have dedicated more than 3 decades to this airline. I have trained half this crew. I have given everything to uphold standards, and now, you're acting like I'm the problem." Her hands shook visibly. Not with rage. With the terror of someone who suddenly saw the truth she'd been avoiding. The businessman in 3C shifted, face darkening. The knitting woman in 5B whispered a soft, motherly sigh. Not pity, but recognition of a fall years in the making. The purser lowered his voice, but his authority sharpened. "Margaret." Stop. She swallowed hard, eyes flashing from him to Evelyn, then to the watching passengers. And in that moment, the facade finally cracked. Her shoulders dropped. Her breath hitched. For the first time tonight, Margaret looked small. She turned sharply and disappeared back into the galley, the curtain trembling behind her like the last echo of a collapsing wall. The purser exhaled. "I'm sorry you had to see that," he said softly to Evelyn. Evelyn shook her head. Truth reveals itself in its own time. As the purser stepped away, Allison approached hesitantly, clutching a stack of water cups with trembling fingers. "Miss Carter," she whispered, "there's something else. I didn't tell you earlier because I didn't want to cause trouble, but the audit. It's not random. Someone filed a complaint about Ms. Doyle weeks ago, a detailed one. Do you know who Evelyn asked quietly?" Allison nodded, expression tight. Another passenger. Someone influential, and the airline took it seriously. Tonight was the tipping point. The pieces slid together. This flight hadn't created the storm, it had revealed it. Evelyn leaned back in her seat, her breath steady, her resolve sharper than ever. She wasn't just a witness now. She was part of the moment the system finally shifted. The aircraft glided deeper into the night, the cabin wrapped in a dim glow that softened every outline but sharpened every emotion. The passengers had settled into an uneasy stillness, hands folded, eyes drifting yet alert. They sensed instinctively that whatever was happening aboard this flight was nearing a breaking point, the kind of moment where people show who they really are. In the galley, muffled sounds broke the quiet. A paper cup knocked over. A drawer slammed shut. A breath caught too sharply. Margaret was unraveling thread by thread behind a thin curtain that could no longer protect her from consequence or witness. Even from her seat, Evelyn felt the vibration of collapse, quiet, human, inevitable. Then the curtain opened. Margaret stepped out, but something essential in her posture had shifted. Her shoulders hunched slightly inward, the proud line of her spine bent by a weight she had carried too long without acknowledging. Her eyes searched the cabin but found no refuge, no friendly face, no place to land. She had worn certainty like armor for years. Tonight, certainty had abandoned her. She moved toward row 3 with a forced steadiness, as if reclaiming control one step at a time. When she reached Evelyn's row, she stopped gripping the seat back so tightly her knuckles whitened. "Ms. Carter," she began, her voice, tight, strained breath, catching on each word. "I understand that earlier things may have been handled with more tension than necessary." The businessman in 3C let out a low, disbelieving exhale. The knitting needles in 5B stopped mid-click. Even Allison paused in the aisle, clutching a stack of ginger ales like she was afraid to breathe. Evelyn looked up calmly. "Go on." Margaret swallowed hard. "If there was any misinterpretation, I apologize." Her jaw clenched at the word apologize, as though her mouth had never been trained to form it. Evelyn held her gaze without flinching. "What exactly are you apologizing for, Miss Doyle?" The question was soft, but it cracked the air like a struck match. Margaret blinked. For the confusion regarding the meal, and the seat discrepancy, and any discomfort you may have felt as a result. "That's not what happened," the older man in 3C said, unable to remain silent any longer. His voice was steady, but edged with anger. "You didn't cause confusion. You caused humiliation." So Margaret snapped, turning on him with the last shred of her authority. "This is not your concern. It became my concern the moment you raised your voice across the cabin," he replied, eyes sharp. And the moment you treated this woman with a level of disrespect I haven't seen in decades of flying." A shiver ran through the aisle, the kind of collective reaction that makes strangers momentarily united. Margaret's face tightened. "I was enforcing protocol." "No," the knitting woman said quietly. "You were enforcing superiority." Margaret's head whipped toward her, but she didn't speak. Couldn't. Tension rippled outward, and the purser quickly stepped forward from the galley, his expression measured, but firm. "Miss Doyle," he said softly, "why don't you take a moment in the aft galley? I can manage the cabin from here." The suggestion, gentle to the ear, devastating to the ego, landed like a final verdict. Margaret stiffened, inhaling sharply as though bracing for impact. "I don't need a moment," she insisted, but her voice faltered at the edges. The purser held her gaze. Not unkind, but unwavering. It wasn't a request. For a breathless second, no one moved. Then Margaret stepped back, shoulders, tight lips, pressed into a thin line. She walked down the aisle, each step more uneven than the last, and disappeared behind the rear galley curtain. The fabric closed behind her with a soft flutter, a quiet punctuation to a long, painful sentence. Silence washed through the cabin. After a long moment, the purser turned to Evelyn. His voice lowered. "We're landing in a few hours. When we do, a member of our operations team will be meeting the flight. They've already been notified." About what exactly, Evelyn asked. About everything he said. The audit, the earlier complaint. And now tonight. Allison lingered a few rows away, eyes shimmering with a mixture of dread and relief. Evelyn exhaled slowly, the tension in her chest shifting into clarity, sharp-edged, steady. "I'll speak with them," she said. "I'll provide my full account." "Thank you," the purser replied. "It means more than you know." As he walked away, the passengers gradually returned to their seats, though their eyes still lingered on row 3. On Evelyn. On the space where Margaret had stood. Evelyn leaned back against the headrest, feeling the cool leather beneath her shoulders. She closed her eyes not to escape, but to anchor herself. Because the truth was emerging now, piece by piece, and soon it would no longer be contained to this cabin, this flight, or this narrow aisle, where one woman's fear had collided with reality. A larger storm had been brewing long before tonight, and Evelyn Carter, sitting quietly at 35,000 feet, knew she was about to step directly into its center. The hours past midnight carried a different kind of quiet, a heavier one, as if the darkness outside pressed gently against the windows. Most passengers had drifted into restless half-sleep, their breathing slow, their limbs slackened, but the cabin still felt awake, watchful. A story had already begun to take shape inside this plane, and no one, not even those dozing under blankets, was free from its gravity. Evelyn wasn't sleeping. She sat still, eyes open, the faint reflections of overhead lights glimmering across her pupils. Her mind worked with the calm of someone accustomed to navigating crisis, not by force, but by precision. Each detail of the night arranged itself in her memory like carefully indexed files. The raised voice, the confiscated entree, the attempted seat challenge, the whispered explanations, the audit, the fear behind Margaret's eyes. Across the aisle, the older businessman stirred, adjusting his blanket. He looked over at Evelyn, not intrusively, but with the quiet solidarity of someone who had watched a wrong unfold and could not forget it now that the lights had dimmed. "You handling all right?" he asked softly, the kind of softness older men use when they want to offer kindness without appearing sentimental. Evelyn nodded once. "I'm all right." "You're steady," he murmured. "Most people would have blown up." "There's no point in heat," she replied. "Only clarity." He smiled faintly, understanding more than he let on, and settled back again. From the rear galley the curtain shifted. Not dramatically, just a slight, uncertain flutter. No one emerged. But the movement itself said enough. Margaret hadn't slept. Not a minute. Even without seeing her face, Evelyn could feel the tremor of someone confronting a truth they'd avoided for years. Alison approached again, her steps light nervous. She held a small tray, just waterfruit and shortbread cookies. "I thought maybe you'd like something," she whispered, not wanting to disturb anyone else. "We still have a few light snacks." Evelyn accepted the tray gently. "You're thoughtful, Alison." The young woman clutched her hands behind her back. They called the crew room again. I overheard the purser talking to operations. They're sending someone senior to meet the flight. Like really senior. Not the usual on-duty supervisor. A message moved across the cabin like a breeze. Quiet, invisible, but perceptible to anyone paying attention. The businessman lifted his eyes again. The knitting woman's fingers paused mid-loop. Even a teenager several rows back opened one eye, sensing something shifting beneath the surface. Evelyn didn't react outwardly. Inside, a deeper understanding settled into place. This wasn't a routine service complaint. It wasn't even about tonight. The airline's internal gears were already turning long before she'd stepped onto this flight. Someone had signaled. Someone had pushed a domino. Tonight simply accelerated the fall. When Alison walked away, Evelyn set the tray neatly on her table, untouched for now. She reached into her tote bag and pulled out her phone. The soft glow illuminated her face with delicate shadows. She scrolled through contacts, not to call, not yet, but to remind herself of the names she might need tomorrow. Then she paused. A new message blinked across the screen. "Flight operations confirms arrival escort for passenger in 3A. Please prepare report." Her gaze hardened slightly. Not with anger, but with comprehension. Someone at corporate already considered her central to what would happen next. They didn't know her identity. Not yet. But they recognized the shape of the incident, the gravity of it, the risk of it. She powered off her phone, letting the screen fade back to darkness. The cabin hum filled the silence again. The purser walked past, heading toward the rear galley. As he passed Evelyn, he paused, lowering his voice. "They'll want to talk to you the moment we land. You won't have to wait long." Evelyn nodded. He hesitated, then added with genuine regret, "Tonight isn't how we want to represent this airline. I'm sorry you were put in this position." His throat tightened faintly, as if he wished he could say more, reveal more, but professionalism held him back. He moved on. When the curtain at the rear lifted for a moment, Evelyn caught a glimpse of Margaret's silhouette. Shoulders slumped, head bowed, hands pressed against the counter as though bracing against the weight of her own fear. The sight did not give Evelyn satisfaction, just understanding. Sometimes people break loudly. Sometimes they break quietly. But either way, breaks reveal truths. The cabin lights dimmed even further, shifting into a warm, amber glow meant to coax passengers toward sleep before the early morning landing. But Evelyn remained fully awake, her mind forming the beginning of a path she knew she would walk after wheels touched the runway. She wasn't angry now. She was ready. Ready for the conversation waiting at the gate. Ready for the questions. ready for the truths that would surface the moment she stepped onto the jet bridge. Because this flight was no longer just a journey across the country. It was the threshold of a reckoning that had been building long before tonight. And Evelyn Carter, steady in her seat at 35,000 feet, knew exactly how to step into it. Dawn crept in slowly, a thin blue gradient stretching across the windows as the aircraft began its long descent. It was the kind of quiet early light that softened edges and revealed truths with gentle precision. Passengers stirred, blinking into consciousness, unaware that the real awakening on this flight had happened hours earlier. But in first class, no one was truly asleep. Evelyn watched the sky shift colors, the soft glow brushing across her face. The night had not exhausted her. It had clarified her. Beneath the calm surface of her breathing, something resolute formed a stillness, with weight like a stone settling into place. She ran a thumb lightly along the seam of her leather tote, not nervously, but thoughtfully. Soon conversations would begin. Soon the real story would take its first step into daylight. Behind the curtain, the rear galley rustled again. A soft, uneven breath reached the aisle, followed by Margaret's muffled attempt to steady herself. She had not slept. Her posture when she finally emerged told the story. Plainly swollen eyes, lips pressed tight, the kind of rigid self-control that hides not composure but panic. Her uniform was immaculate, but her expression had frayed. Passengers lifted their heads one by one. No one stared. They simply watched her, with the quiet recognition older generations carry the understanding of consequences, finally catching up to someone who had run from them too long. The purser approached Margaret, voice measured. "We're landing in 20 minutes. Operations will be meeting the flight. They've asked for a full crew presence." The words struck something inside her. Her inhale was sharp, quick, betrayed by a tremor she tried to swallow. She didn't look at Evelyn, but the instinct to glance was there fighting beneath her rigid self-control. Evelyn's gaze stayed forward, unflinching, but not unkind. She wasn't watching to see Margaret fall. She was watching to see the truth reveal itself. The businessman in 3C leaned toward Evelyn. "Feels like the air in here's about to get real thick." "It was thick hours ago," Evelyn replied softly. "People are only starting to feel it now." He nodded, eyes thoughtful. "You remind me of someone who used to run my company's compliance division." Quiet, but the whole room changed when she spoke. Evelyn offered a faint smile. Rooms only change if they need to. Down the aisle, Allison made her way forward with slow, deliberate steps, balancing a tray of breakfast options. Her nerves from the night before had shifted into something firmer, an early sense of purpose. She paused at Evelyn's row, her voice gentle but steady. "Would you like fruit or yogurt, Miss Carter, coffee?" Evelyn said. "Black." Allison nodded. "Right away." Before she moved on, she whispered, "They're gathering documents, emails, the audit notes. I heard the purser talking to the captain. They think tonight's outcome may connect to more than just this flight." Evelyn absorbed the information quietly. Not surprised, just confirmed. The knitting woman in 5B set down her yarn. "My dear," she called softly, her warm voice drifting into row 3. "Some people spend their lives convincing themselves they're untouchable. But the world has a way of tapping them on the shoulder when it's time to change." Her husband nodded, smiling at Evelyn with the earnest dignity of a man who had lived a long, principled life. "And sometimes," he added, "people like you need to be in the room when that happens." Evelyn didn't respond. She simply placed a hand over her tote, grounding herself in the weight of her own purpose. She could feel something immense waiting on the other side of the landing gear. Questions, decisions, revelations. The intercom clicked on. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain. We've begun our descent into Seattle. Local time is 6:23 in the morning." Passengers straightened. Seatbacks clicked upright. Window shades lifted. But Evelyn stayed centered in her stillness, breathing deep, quiet breaths. Preparing. As the plane dipped below the cloud line, city lights glimmered beneath them, blurred by thin fog. A few raindrops streaked across the window. Dawn in Seattle always arrived with a certain solemnity, like an old friend who knew how to carry heavy stories. Evelyn felt that weight now. Not burden. Readiness. She looked once more toward the galley. Margaret stood, rigid hands clasped in front of her, as though preparing for judgment. Evelyn returned her gaze to the window. This was not about vengeance, not about teaching someone a lesson. This was about truth, aligning with consequence, gently but firmly. The wheels touched the runway with a low, resonant roar. A shudder ran through the cabin, subtle but unmistakable, like a deep breath before a confession. When the plane slowed to taxi, Evelyn exhaled once long and steady. Seattle awaited. Operations awaited. Accountability awaited. And Evelyn Carter, calm, centered, and resolute, was ready to step into the dawn that belonged to her. The jet bridge felt colder than the cabin, a thin draft pushing against passengers as they stepped into the terminal. Morning light spilled through high windows, soft but unforgiving, illuminating every face, every expression, every trace of the night that had unfolded in the sky. Evelyn walked with measured steps, the leather strap of her tote resting securely on her shoulder, her posture steady. She sensed the shift before she saw it. 3 people waiting beyond the podium, their stances too formal, their gazes too focused to be standard arrival staff. The man in the center stepped forward. His badge read Senior Operations Manager, and his expression carried a practiced neutrality meant to hide urgency. "Ms. Carter?" he said, voice polite, respectful, but edged with tension. "Thank you for agreeing to speak with us. We'll take you to a private conference room. It won't take long." Passengers slowed, watching with curiosity, but Evelyn simply nodded. Of course. As she followed the operations team down a quiet corridor, she caught a glimpse of Margaret being escorted in the opposite direction by a uniformed supervisor. Margaret's face was pale, drained, her eyes glassy. Her hands clasped tightly in front of her knuckles white. She did not look at Evelyn. She looked straight ahead, as if focusing on a distant point might keep her standing. Evelyn did not feel triumph, only inevitability. The conference room was small, lined with glass walls and oak trim. A pot of untouched coffee sat on a tray, steam faintly rising. The operations manager motioned for her to sit. Across from her, 2 additional representatives joined the table, a woman from customer experience and a compliance officer with a tablet already open. "Ms. Carter," the manager began, "we appreciate your patience and cooperation. Before we proceed, is there anything you would like to say?" Evelyn folded her hands. "I'd like to hear your questions first." The compliance officer leaned forward. "We've received multiple signals regarding last night's service. Some came directly from the flight. Others came from our audit division, which has been reviewing crew conduct on long-haul flights. Your experience aligns with complaints filed by several other passengers in recent weeks." The customer experience representative added, "We are not asking for a complaint. We are requesting a factual account so we can complete our investigation and determine appropriate action." Evelyn nodded slowly. Then I'll give you the facts. Her voice remained even-controlled, each sentence measured. Your senior flight attendant raised her voice at me before I'd even left my seat. She removed a meal without explanation, then fabricated a seat discrepancy in an attempt to justify her actions. She used tone and posture to diminish, not clarify. Her behavior was aimed not at protocol, but at preserving her sense of superiority. The compliance officer typed quickly. Evelyn continued. I observed how she spoke to other crew members as well. Fear, not respect, governed their interactions. Your purser attempted to stabilize the situation, but Ms. Doyle challenged his authority. Her behavior reflects not one incident, but a broader issue of professionalism. She paused briefly. I'm not angry. I'm concerned. A system that allows someone under audit to remain in sole charge of a first-class cabin risks the well-being of customers and crew alike. You have cracks forming in your culture, and they're beginning to show. Silence filled the room, heavy but clarifying. The operations manager exhaled slowly. Ms. Carter, thank you. That aligns with what we've seen in our internal notes. We've been investigating Ms. Doyle's conduct for several weeks. The pattern you described matches several previous events. The customer experience representative added softly. Your composure during the flight was noted by multiple witnesses. You diffused an escalation without contributing to it. For that, we're grateful. Evelyn met her gaze steadily. I don't seek gratitude, just responsibility. The manager exchanged a glance with the others. We intend to act decisively. Ms. Doyle has been placed on leave effective immediately. Further disciplinary action will be determined after the formal review. Evelyn breathed in, then nodded. I understand. The compliance officer hesitated. There's something else. Your name was flagged in our system during landing. Not negatively, just as a courtesy alert from your travel profile. It appears you hold senior executive credentials with Northwest Culinary Partners. A quiet moment passed. Evelyn didn't hide anything. She simply confirmed, I do. The manager sat straighter. Then I assume you are aware of the significance of the policies your company provides for our in-flight service. I'm aware, she said calmly. My expectations remain the same as any passenger's. Dignity, fairness, professionalism. The room felt different after that. More respectful. More deliberate. As though everyone finally understood the scale of who they were speaking to, not because of her title, but because of her steadiness. The customer experience representative leaned forward carefully. Ms. Carter, is there anything we could have done differently tonight that you would want, reflected in our recommendations? Yes, Evelyn said. You can train your teams to recognize the difference between authority and care, and you can hold your leaders to higher standards than the people they supervise. The operations manager nodded. We will. They concluded the meeting with formal thanks, but Evelyn sensed the shift beneath the words, the beginning of reform, small but meaningful. She stepped out into the terminal, the early morning bustle rising around her passengers, tugging suitcases, airport speakers, announcing departures in calm monotones. As she approached the exit, she found Allison standing near a support pillar, clutching a to-go cup of tea. Her eyes widened when she saw Evelyn. Miss Carter, she said, voice quiet but hopeful. Did it go okay? Evelyn smiled softly. It went as it needed to. Allison breathed out relief flooding her features. Thank you for how you handled everything. Most people would have made it worse. Most people react, Evelyn replied. Few choose to respond. Allison nodded the lesson, settling into her like a seed planted gently but deeply. I hope I get to serve you again someday. Under better circumstances. I'd like that, Evelyn said. She stepped toward the exit, the morning air just visible beyond the sliding doors. The sky was still grey, but light was rising. A new day, clean and open. As Evelyn walked into it, there was no triumph in her stride. Only purpose. Only clarity. Because the world doesn't change when someone shouts. It changes when someone decides to hold a system accountable. And sometimes all it takes is one steady voice in a quiet cabin at 35,000 feet. If you found this story meaningful, please like, subscribe, and comment 3 English words to share your thoughts.